welcome to Varn Blog. And today I am back with Daniel Bessner, co-host of American Prestige, associate professor of international studies at University of Washington, man about town in LA, author of, Democracy in Exile, and I believe your Imperial Realism book is still being in production, or is it?
Yeah, I should be. It should be done by this summer. That's
Okay.
when I think it'll be done. And then so I don't know, whenever Zero will get it out in the autumn or winter or spring. That is not up to me. But yeah, it'll be done. It's basically done.
Okay, good. And we had a discussion at, I think last time we talked, it was right as the Afghanistan situation was winding down, and it looked like Biden was Hadrian's walling the American empire. And it feels like in international news that there have been 1,000 things for leftists to get excited about and then be, frankly, precipitously wrong about and outflanked by pretty much everybody.
So Varn, like, give me some details. Who are you talking about? Or if you don't want to name names,
no,
what arguments
I can
are
name
you
names
talking about?
here. I mean, Hudson and Michael Hudson and all these people who were arguing that, particularly in the beginning of the Ukraine war, you saw a lot more people arguing it was going to completely kill U.S. dollar hegemony. That the U.S. was in a more precarious state than Europe. Was also asserted quite a bit by many leftists online about a year and a half ago. And American Decline,
Turns out, that was not the case.
Right. So one thing I think is interesting, I do think there is some truth to the American Decline narrative, because I think in general capitalism's having some problems right now, but it also seems true that no matter what the left predicts here, that the essential core of American foreign policy and America's ability to dominate a unipolar or, quote, multipolar world remains pretty much untouched.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think that there is a shift. I think you're right. It's certainly not 1990 any longer. It's not 1945 any longer. I mean, if you just look at the pure statistics of it, the United States is nowhere near as absolutely powerful as it was back then. But nevertheless, it is still overwhelmingly powerful. I think you're going to probably mostly see the U.S. empire in the next several years. I mean, it could be 5 years, it could be 20. It's difficult to make exact predictions like that when you're talking about structural shifts. But I think you're going to see a reduction of the U.S. presence in East Asia. I think you're going to see the rise of national militaries in places like Japan and South Korea and Indonesia and Australia. Not to say that these places don't have national militaries or their command structure, I think, is going to be different. But I still think within sort of I hate when people say sort of, I do think within the larger structure of geopolitics, the United States will remain hegemonic. And I think this brings us, if we're thinking about the left, to a lot of interesting questions, which is, it's 2023 now. The proletariat was not, or did not become, for whatever reason, the object of history. There's lots of reasons why that may be. But one of the things that I think that failure points to is the power of states and the power of physical security apparatuses and the power of the military. So I think we on the left are very good at understanding economic shifts, but I don't think we're particularly great at understanding how these larger economic shifts play into other types of what I would determine equally as important bases of social life, like the ability to kill someone, the ability to control military forces. And so I think that is a really interesting question for leftists to talk about in the next several years as we remain on the sidelines looking at things.
Why do you think the left has been so unwilling to connect the two? I mean, in some ways it's obvious, for example, that U.S. trade hegemony, yes, is partly based on the productive capacity of the U.S. And yes, if the U.S. didn't have that productive capacity, it would not have the kind of currency reserve power that it does. But it's also true that like we just also run the deep blue sea trade routes, and
I mean, we went into Europe and forced them to use the dollar, and that was not due to productive forces. That was due to the power of the U.S. military. Fundamentally, I would say, for example, when you're looking at something like dollar hegemony, I would say it's actually more fundamental U.S. military power than anything else. I would say it's equally as a base, and it's sort of like you need your Engels with your Marx kind of situation. And if anybody wants an interesting sort of introduction to Engels's thought and how his thinking about the military might have shaped early Marxism. There's an interesting essay by Zygmunt Neumann and Mark von Hagen, I believe, in a volume called The Makers of Modern Strategy. And you could check that out, and it just kind of gives like a summary of Engels's thought. But yeah, so I think it could be an intellectually interesting time, if not necessarily one of politics. And of course, that's another reason that the left doesn't really talk about this, because it has never come close to wielding power in this country being the United States.
Right. I think that's pretty clear. I made the observation earlier today that like when the left sees itself as ascendant, like it did in the 20 teens, it doesn't talk about foreign policy at all. Like it is almost completely off the left's radar. And the moment it hits a snag, I don't know why it always seems to hit a snag when its allies in the Democratic Party win, but that definitely does seem to be the case. I mean, I kind of do know, but you see the reverse tendency, this overwhelming focus on foreign policy, championing, foreign leaders from very expert, skilled politicians like Lula all the way down to people like Castillo, who, did not manage the situation well.
Yeah, I mean, like this is the classic sort of. It was during the Cold War called Third World Romanticism, and now is sort of like Global South Romanticism. The U.S. left likes looking to other leaders that seem to, in some way, challenge U.S. imperialism. That's a good thing. I mean, those leaders should challenge U.S. imperialism. It's good that Lula won, and it's good that Lula, at least rhetorically, gestures toward challenging U.S. imperialism. Same with AMLO. These are good things, but I think if you're looking at it from an analytical or structural perspective, I'm not sure that they're of structural imports, perhaps, regardless of whether they point to how you could do things in new ways while there are leaders to admire for particular reasons. I don't think they change just the facts on the ground of U.S. foreign policy fundamentally.
And what are the current facts on the ground? It does seem like
the U.S. could kill any country on Earth.
Yeah,
I mean, fundamentally, that's the fact, right? That's the material fact of nuclear weapons. That is as important a revolution as the Industrial Revolution, if we're thinking in terms of geopolitics, in my opinion. That gives nuclear powers, particularly those like the United States, which are so armed to the teeth and so able to deliver nuclear weapons around the world, a kind of veto power of geopolitical relations. Yeah, so that's that's that.
Yeah, I think maybe even this is something to kind of tease apart. I thought that the Russia-Ukraine war, interestingly, has in many ways reinforced.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
U.S. power in ways that people don't always seem to pick up. I mean, there are obvious ways NATO's unified.
It did. I mean, it just showed that it wasn't that. And this is what I thought from the beginning, not to take away the actual lived experience of people on the ground. But again, if we're talking about geopolitical structures, I never thought it was going to be especially important. Why would it be especially important? Russia's a middle declining power, and Ukraine doesn't really have much to do with U.S. national interests or the U.S.'s global position. So there are historical reasons why the United States decided to become invested, or really why Americans decided to become invested in this particular conflict related to, how the U.S. has imagined Russia and the Soviet Union over the past century. I think race did have a thing to play in it. You didn't see as much fervor over Syria. I think that had to do with reasons related to race. And also just social media is now a bigger thing than it's ever been before. And people are politicized due to the Bernie campaign and due to the sort of success of that socialist populism. and they're politicized. And so when an event looks political, they get involved. But for all the Sturm und Drang, there's no reason, if you look at it, why it would have a structural effect.
Yeah, it does seem to have having a structural effect on Europe, though. Like,
I mean, it's just reinforced Europe's connection to the extant connection to the United States, right? Yeah, I wouldn't say it's had that much of a structural effect. Now Europe is really into the United States instead of just into.
Right. Well, it seemed, what I was surprised by is how, like, Chinese diplomatic planners, for example, thought that they would be able to peel Europe off of the United States relatively soon, and did not seem to factor how this Ukraine-Russia conflict would very
I mean, who knows what's really going on in the Chinese state? I have no idea.
That's true.
This is my historian thing. This is why, in some sense, I'm not super interested in these day-to-day politics, because when people, the analysis you're basing it off of is so surface. We just do not know what is really going. I mean, even just in terms of pure behavior, like where are the decision points in the Chinese state, let alone like the deeper structural relationships and forces that are shaping a decision at any particular moment. So it's just very difficult to know. And I mean, I think it's like it becomes like sports. The kids who didn't want to watch football or whatever pay attention to this. But it's ultimately a distraction. None of us have political power, and so this is how we occupy ourselves.
Well, yeah, that's fair. And I was gonna say I have to base everything I'm saying off of, like, basically China's official accounts of what's happened and how it's frustrated. Yeah. Like, we don't know, and I point out that, like, even having spent time in China, although not super significant time, that the structure of the regional power bases in China are totally opaque to me, and when people try to explain them, they often can't. Like, it's just...
Yeah, I mean, think about, like, we're still arguing over what Stalin did in 1950.
Right. So trying to figure out, like, who's actually making what decision where, and what the factions are in a party that does not recognize its own factionalism is a very hard thing to peel out contemporaneously.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So... Although I do think we can, I think we can talk about one prediction that the U.S. left made in its last 2 years that has turned out to be, at least for now, kind of just wrong, is how quickly that the Belt and Road Initiative has seemed to have just sort of like stalled out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that China just doesn't have. I made this point before. But the U.S. empire was attached to a particular form of Protestant Christian millenarianism that is ironically that people like George Kennan read on to the Soviet Union, this sense of global mission. I never thought China really wanted to pursue that project, at least what it would cost, which it would come at the expense effectively of domestic development, upon which the legitimacy of the CCP rests. And so the second it became clear that might have that effect, you abandon the Belt and Road Initiative. Moreover, the CCP was dealing with any nation, right? It was not like this grand ideological project. It dealt with nations regardless of their professed ideologies. And this leads me to another sort of thought I'm working through, which is that we really are living in a post-ideological age. And in that sense, Francis Fukuyama, I think, was right. Not that like liberalism is great. There is that valence to his essay, but it's not the only valence. But the idea that there's been no competing ideologies, there hasn't been. Everyone says capitalist, and there's a different form of capitalism.
Well, that book, when it describes Japan as the ultimate manifestation of a post-ideological age, it is not without its hesitancies and fears, and Fukuyama is an interesting figure to me, actually, because I tend to think on one hand I don't agree with him, but on the other hand, his insights about the way nations work right now, I think, is actually kind of accurate. And
when you say agree, what do you mean, if you don't mind?
I mean, I don't agree with his triumphalism about elements of it, but even he sees the problems, and
it's like, it's at best 2 cheers. It's a pretty grim essay in parts, actually. I mean, this piece I'm writing for The Nation, I basically argue it's like a breakup letter to the Soviet Union. like he there's an element of longing, sort of what the Germans would call Sehnsucht in the piece. It's not, people who say it's triumphalist haven't read it. It's just like flat out not.
And his recent statements that he, we may be back in a history phase, seems to be just pointing out that like none of these nations are making ideological decisions. They're all
Right.
It's all realpolitik all the way down.
Yeah, I mean, and I personally think that like I would even say that I'm not sure nations have been making ideological decisions since the mid 1960s. Really,
Mm-hmm.
I think they were in the 50s. That really, in my opinion, is the height of the ideological Cold War, or maybe even ideology generally. But I think by the mid to late 60s, that really has faded on both sides of the Iron Curtain, at least when it comes to the superpowers. Less so when it comes to other powers. But the left loves arguing about ideologies, so that's what we do.
I mean, because it's
ironically giving causal power to ideas, which is not Marxist.
Yeah, that drives me up the wall, actually. So when we talk about ideologies and we just like, well, states have this, and I'm like, it doesn't matter what they believe or think. Like, aren't we supposed to know that what they say justifies what they do isn't what justifies what they do anyway? Like, I don't know. To that end, I've been reading a lot of more conservative thinkers like Peter Zion, who interestingly, like politically, kind of makes me turn on my stomach, but whose predictions have been consistently better about what the U.S. and the rest of the world was going to do than what I'm hearing out of the left. Why do you think that? I guess he would consider himself kind of a center-right liberal, but why do you think they have been more on it? Because he has predicted that like the U.S. empire was in a retreating mode and it's going to continue in that retreating mode, but there's a whole lot of stuff we can do and there's not really a counterpower to it,
Yeah, I mean, I guess the left likes to fantasize about victory, because that's the only way to keep going. I think, maybe the left within it has a type of dialectical structure inherent in its reasoning, where it thinks that things will necessarily be transcended, and come up with something better. I'm not sure that's actually the case. I'm not sure that philosophy of history is accurate, at least barring some type of exogenous shock. Which of course, I mean, things change, absolutely, but I think like the only way capitalism, let's just say it's been late capitalism for a while. I think we might just be in capitalism at this point, and maybe that it's not going to be transcended, because I can't even imagine the subject of that transformation right now. I mean, maybe there'll be a meteor or climate change, and there'll be some sort of exogenous thing that just tumbles the world, and that'll be a transformation. But that's not really what the dialectical approach would say would happen.
So one of the things that I have noticed in a lot of your speaking about this, and something that I've thought a lot about, is that in general, leftists, Marxists have tended to not look at the way World War II and nuclear arms changed the nature of the state. I think Christopher Lasch used to be infamous, although it's not very read anymore. Essay about is revolution obsolete? Is basically the entire argument is like, what do you do now that states have nuclear bombs? Because it means that outside insurrections are not really viable. Inside insurrections are much less likely, and you're also a lot less likely to have any significant portion of the military on your side.
Yeah,
so what do you mean by revolution?
So these are right. So these are the structuring conditions. The state is just a lot more difficult to control than it was in like 1914. The military and police forces are a lot more powerful, and it's just as an apparatus much more difficult to control. So that's fundamental to what does a revolution actually look like. Then you have, like you said, nuclear weapons, but even more than that. I mean, again, back in the day, there wasn't that big a difference between what the military arms a state could muster and the military arms a potential revolution could muster. That's no longer true. A lot fewer people could use drones to decimate a lot more people. So what does a revolution look like in that situation? And then today, if you look at like what often spurred revolutions, it was things like food riots. And calories post-Green Revolution, especially in the North Atlantic world, especially in the United States, are very, very cheap. and are people going to risk their lives if they're not starving? I think it's much less likely. So it's just basically fantasy cosplay, and people get mad at that, but I don't know why. It's just the reality.
I mean, it's hard to tell people, hey, this thing that you've invested so much into is at minimum not a likely strategy. If you want to think about what revolution means now, you can't base it off of late 19th century and early 20th century insurrections or asymmetrical warfare in occupied territories, because that's all you got, right?
Yeah, which is nothing.
Another thing, though, I wanted, we would talk about like the U.S. power. I've also thought this Ukraine war has illustrated that while the U.S. was not particularly competent in its management of the Middle East, that maybe this idea that a lot of people have projected that
Well,
everybody
made a
else,
lot of people a lot of money. Maybe it
but
was
that's
pretty
true.
competent, right? Like
Fair enough.
if one of the major goals of that, I mean, structurally, not even intentionally, even though it of course was intentional sometimes. I mean, it made a shit ton of people a lot of money, and right, Eric, I don't think that, like in a conspiratorial way, but it's worth noting that after Afghanistan, we get Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, and one that's actually in some ways better for the arms industry because no Americans are directly involved if they don't want to be.
Right, it's perfect. Yeah, just send weapons forever. Just send weapons to a region that's not gonna, hopefully for they hope not to redound to negative American benefit.
Um, but another thing that seems to have illustrated is just the military incompetence was not actually all. I mean, the assumption that I saw, and people don't understand, the U.S. military would itself have reason to put this out there. Was that the Russian military would say win against the U.S. in a war in Europe. And while I want to caveat this as a fully mobilized war between NATO and Russia would look a lot different and have a lot different structural incentives than the war between Russia and Ukraine, that it kind of proved that the fourth generation asymmetrical warfare stuff was true for anybody, not just the United States.
Yeah, and the thing is, that doesn't really matter because you don't need to conquer territory like it's 1525 anymore. So it just becomes a space, these types of conflict zones where huge defense contractors make a ton of money, and it doesn't really, I mean, maybe gas prices rise for a few months, but my life and most Americans' lives has not been appreciably different since Russia invaded Ukraine.
Now, do we think that this is going to have a long-term effect on Europe?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, for example, I've just been watching the UK poverty rate jump up because of mixture of energy prices and Brexit nonsense. And it does seem like Europe's precarity in regards to calories, both in terms of energy and in terms of food, has been a little bit more noted.
Perhaps. And then I think you would see Europe moving slightly. I do think, again, I do think Europe will move a little bit further away from the United States in the next 15 or 20 years. It's just going to be relatively less powerful, the US and Europe. You're going to see a pursuit of a genuinely independent European foreign policy for things like this. Is Germany really going to give up its heat to protect Estonia? I have my doubts. And I think you're going to see things like that, yes, in the medium to long terms.
So I guess this brings up this part of the world that we were talking about the U.S. pulling away from, and that is East Asia. How do you see this really changing the situation from in the longue durée with Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, India, which I think people have really not been paying a lot of attention to, and its geopolitics, etc.
I mean, I think you'll have some sort of regional balance of power arise. I don't think China is going to be as hegemonic in East Asia as the U.S. has been able to be in the Western Hemisphere. So my guess is some typical alliance structure that attempts to balance against each other, with India and China being the biggest poles in that region, and then various alliances around that with Pakistan, Japan, South Korea, with Japan and South Korea having more independent militaries over time. Indonesia and Australia getting involved, New Zealand, Philippines, Vietnam, Southeast Asia as well. And yeah, you'll have a typical sort of regional balance in some regard. I don't think China's going to start invading Japan.
Well, yeah, me either. um, I have been just really thinking about like what that alliance is going to look like, because I think people have not been paying attention to the tensions between India and China not actually being resolved by their both being loyal to Russia and the international sphere, and loyalty in quotation marks, like softly on their side. Because
both nuclear powers,
yeah, both nuclear powers, both in economic competition, and I think like people have been ignoring like India's buildup of its navy to like curtail. That's
typical balancing behavior on both China coming closer to Pakistan, typical balancing behavior, and that's what a 101 intro to IR course would predict. Basically, states unite to balance against the larger states.
So I guess this can bring us to kind of a general criticism of the left's understanding of political economy. With liberals often gets reduced to politics, but with leftists tends to get reduced to either economics or morality, depending on their mood. But there is a real sense in which political economy and Marxism is supposed to be wedded together. Like, we are supposed to look at these as, like, you can't separate the economic system from the military system from the governmental system.
The left really has people, when the left tends toward that, it's because they don't hold political power effectively, and so there's there are elements in Marx that seem like he's arguing for a semi-natural transformation of capitalism. There are elements of Marx where he seems to be arguing that only through the proletariat becoming conscious of itself will capitalism be transcended, and so I tend to think that the latter one was the one that needed to happen, that you need to have sort of an agentive, self-conscious working class. I guess internationally seems difficult in retrospect for that one to have happened, to recognize themselves as workers and then unite to seize the means of production and use them for humans, as opposed to having humans be alienated from their labor. That didn't happen.
Right.
It just didn't. And I don't see how that happens today, because the social relationships upon which that vision of history depended, which is like literally you stand next to Jacques at the factory all day for years and years and years, and you're willing to die for Jacques on some level, don't exist anymore. Capital has succeeded in reshaping labor relations to the point where everyone's an independent contractor or working 3 jobs until exhausted to form those sorts of social relationships.
Yeah.
Plus, democracy obviously isn't actually connected to the will of the people in a structural sense. So I don't see how that subject-object is, I guess, activated.
It's interesting because my reading of this is like, if that was going to happen, it would have happened right after World War One. If you
or
look
before,
at or right before World War One, really, when the social contradictions really were that high and that violent. And
it did happen after World War One. It was too late. The Hungarian Revolution, the Bavarian Revolution, this various Soviets, that's the 1819 German Revolution. I think that indicates it was because you had these states which have been so built up over those 4 years as these military states that they were just very difficult to actually overtake. Plus, like the racist xenophobia, nationalism that of a bunch of young men with destroyed brains from the experience of the trench also made that sort of transformation. I think that the moment was 1913-14. Right. And like, I think if you, let's say, how we look at like Roman history in like these 70-year spans, in 1,000 years, if someone's looking back, they'll be like, wow, that 1914, that was when it really could have gone a different way. Also, nationalism is not as felt throughout a lot of Europe. The war is really crucial to that. So you could actually imagine people identifying themselves more as workers than as part of a nation. That's also more difficult after World War One. I think Uta Frevert's book, A Nation in Barracks, I think that's about World War I, but I think that argument holds generally that these large scale military experiences are really crucial to forming nationalism.
Right. I mean, it is arguable there's no U.S. nation, for example, until the Civil War, and you just kind of take that logic out and look at it.
Yeah, or nationness is weak.
Mm,
Yeah, her book is like a survey, but I think it proves that these experiences are really crucial, and World War I is really crucial in particular.
and also, I mean, this puts Marxism in a particular conundrum that I'd be intellectually fascinated with, which is Marxism's like of dual and seemingly contradictory obsession with one with national liberation, but in national autonomy, and
Well, when you say
two
Marxism, you're referring to Soviet Marxism and like
Soviet
the
Marxism
Marxism.
and Second International Marxism too. Like, so it goes back before Soviet Marxism, but the argument about about the national question and national autonomy, which dominates Second International discussions, right? Uh, it's interesting, and then it gets manifested in Soviet policy, where we're deliberately even creating nations are national subjects to modernize, under the idea that that will somehow also in development fade away.
Yeah,
Which
I mean, Marxism always has a vexed relationship with colonialism because it really is a theory designed to understand what's happening in Europe. And then it's
mm-hmm.
it's obviously applied to different places, and there are insights that allow you to talk about world systems. But I mean, Marx was really thinking that it would be Germany that would do this, and he's reacting fundamentally to England and Germany, I think, more than anywhere else. And so those are really in my opinion, not totally, but the structuring examples of his theory. Um, and so when you apply that to colonialism, you meet these various problems at various moments.
Well, I mean, that does lead to the whole irony of the successful Marxist revolutions being, I mean, this is an obvious irony, being all outside of the
Yeah,
area
yeah,
in which
yeah.
they were supposed to happen.
Right. And so, like, I mean, the big question is, the big hinge point is, what if it had happened in Germany?
Right.
That's a very different story than it happened in like what in Marxist framings would be a semi-peripheral country like Russia, the Russian Empire, a type of peasant based economy in a lot of regards. And I mean, this is what Lenin was doing, right? This is what all
Mm-hmm.
those guys were doing. They were applying Marxist theory to a different historical situation, and they showed that you could do it, at least from a strategic political perspective. I mean, I think it's pretty clear it didn't turn out how Marx would have wanted.
Right.
Hard to say. Do people still argue otherwise? I mean, I guess they do,
So,
but I
yeah,
think it's difficult to say that.
you will meet people on the internet and occasionally writing for publications who argue otherwise, but in general, that's a hard position to maintain, particularly since Soviet Union collapses in 1992, which I hardly think anyone would argue was a good thing. On ours, well, maybe people do argue it's a good thing, even on our side of the fence, but you know,
I mean, I think
um,
the battle was lost by then. By
oh
the
yeah,
collapse of the Soviet Union, probably for decades. If the Soviet Union was ever going to be a liberatory force, which let's presume that it was, things start going wrong pretty early, um, due to both the personality of someone like Stalin, but also due to the structural problems that the Russian Empire slash Soviet Union was facing. It was not an advanced, developed economy like the economies of Western Europe, at least in comparative perspective. They're also, it's not like the economies of Western Europe didn't have their own agricultural sector either, but it was just a different thing. So yeah, I mean, it was a tough thing to get done from the start. I
oh
mean,
yeah.
it's easier to be oppressive like capitalism than liberatory. Also, the project is more difficult. It's a higher degree of difficulty. Like if you're watching figure skating, higher degree of difficulty. The left's the goal.
So, considering all that, what should the left like? On one hand, I think we can adequately say that the left, in so much that it has a foreign policy, is generally reactive and often not thinking things through from a perspective of real material power. On the other hand, it's like, well, what are they supposed to do?
Live their lives, man. I mean, like, I think that's why someone like my friend Matt Chrisman, right? He's like, you also got to like live a life worth living, and he's taken a type of spiritual turn in a sense. I think it's because of that, right? Because you could really go wild if you just spend all your days in front of a screen, thinking through these abstract debates that have almost no real world consequence. It's kind of the equivalent of people who are on the center being like obsessed with the minutia of congressional politics. The same thing as being obsessed with fighting about between Lenin and Kautsky. I mean, there's no communist movement. What are you fighting about? That I've said this before, but I think, what does it mean to identify yourself as a communist in practical terms? It means you have a series of beliefs, right? There's no social basis for these beliefs because there's no workers' movement. So you're effectively already conceding that you're playing the game of a type of liberal identity politics because there is no actual social base. Now that's fine. I mean, I think like it does indicate a type of moral positioning. And it is important for people to, I mean, I guess theoretically important for people to be aware of their own political positions. But absent a social movement based in masses of people, which might not even be possible. I wrote an essay about the end of mass politics. I think that formation might not even be possible. You're just basically branding yourself, which we all do. I mean, I no shade. I do that. Everyone does that because that is the structural condition under which we live. But I think it's also important just to take a step back and recognize that. And if you think, if you put too much of your emotions in something that is very, very unlikely to happen, I don't think you're going to be a happy person. And on some level, metaphysically, we only get one chance at this beautiful thing called life, and one has to make choices in how they live it.
I was going to ask you, like, I've listened to Matt, and I find of the Chapo people, and a lot of people come out of that milieu, he's the one that I've always sort of like, well, I kind of get what he's saying. But when people ask how to live their lives, I think the question becomes that their lives are already kind of messed up by structural conditions, or they wouldn't be attracted to a politics like this in the first place. And
well, I mean, there is a moral imperative too. Like I do think there's a moral core to leftism. It's not just reaction or feeling on the margins, right? I mean, there is a moral core, I think. Maybe it's sometimes people lose sight of it when you're fighting online all day, but there is a moral. I mean, people do it for moral reasons. They do genuinely want to make the world a better place. They do genuinely want to redistribute resources.
Yeah, that's an
interesting. And then there's a subcultural element as well.
Yeah,
like being a punk.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. What about the contemporary moment do you think leads people to political identifications as their branding, as opposed to, say, aesthetic ones? Because I have said, and I teach high school, so I deal with high schoolers, and you will occasionally meet like your high school Stalinist, which was not something that you would meet.
I mean, for millennials, it's general proletarianization. Millennials and younger, there's general proletarianization, and when people aren't getting the resources that they expected, that's a classic formula for politicization. I think it's as simple as that. The rate of profit is falling, and it's becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small select elites, and the quote unquote middle class is proletarianizing. Add college into the mix, and that's a recipe for politicization. I think it's that.
But I suppose, though, that leads to a kind of seeming contradiction of mass politicization without mass politics, and
precisely, yeah.
That seems like edging yourself into insanity, honestly.
Politicization of many people that do not cohere to form a mass is how one might describe it. I think that's what's happening. So yeah, that's why I think that's a reason why everyone feels like they're banging their head against the wall a lot, because all this conversation doesn't go anywhere. The military budget's still raised. You're still not getting that cost of living increase. Healthcare is still insurmountable. It's very difficult to have a family, but all you do is spend your time talking and thinking about politics. It's not a recipe for happiness.
No, it's not. And it's It's also not a good recipe for understanding politics. I
No,
mean,
it's
that's
not. And I think that's why it probably leads to people believing or, motivated reasoning and believing that the war in Ukraine somehow symbolizes the end of the American empire. I
yeah.
wish.
If only.
If
Uh,
only.
I suppose. Do you also think this is partly because most people, not just leftists, but most people in general, are further removed from power and the locuses of power in their life than they are in the past? Like, um,
Yeah, I mean that's like the great victory of the American state after 1945. It's basically removed foreign policy and macroeconomic decision making from the people's will. So then like those are two pretty important things, particularly macroeconomic decision making. There's no democratic control of the economy, and that's what matters most to people. I still think fundamentally, in
mm-hmm.
some metaphysical sense, material resources matter, quote unquote, more. Not the only thing, but they matter. They are a base in some sense. And when you have no control over that, it's not a good situation. It leads one toward sort of states of mind that are not great.
Do you see a whole lot of? I mean, we've already said that the classical Marxist, theory. Like I've been saying this now for about 10 years. The classical Marxist theory of revolution is based off of a historical period that doesn't deal with the state that we have now, that doesn't deal with the capacity of the state that we have now, and doesn't really deal with how much World War I and World War II really changed the nature of governance.
Yeah, I mean, people were saying that in like the 20s. This is since Bernstein in the late 19th
mm,
century, this has been a long-standing issue with Marxist theory. I mean, the problem is there's no like ferment Marxist theoretical living world anymore. It's all like confined to the academy, right? So it all takes on these incredibly abstract notions. Back in the day, there were like workers involved, and you were the intellectuals were somehow engaged with workers in a genuinely organic way, not always, but sometimes, and they that met the same organizations. Now no one meets anyone anywhere. So I mean, I totally agree, but I just want to highlight that
yeah.
this is a long the tradition within Marxism to revise Marx is ongoing.
Well, and I think you have to talk about differences in strategies. Like one thing that if we're being materialist and we talk about why, for example, it's great that Starbucks is unionizing. It's great that certain Seattle shops, I mean not Seattle, so certain Amazon shops are unionizing. I'm not opposed to it. I'm not mocking it, but there's still a way in which when people talk about the workers' movement, they haven't talked about what deindustrialization has meant for it, as far as like the strategies of bargaining and socialization and um
Yeah, I mean, there's just like no real workers movement, at least when compared to what like a workers movement looked like when
right.
that term meant something. I think basically the bourgeoisie effectively bought off the working class with consumption in the middle of the 20th century, and that's still kind of happening. That's still kind of going on, even though that is going away now, both for environmental and power reasons. Um, but yeah, I mean that's just what happened. Uh, Not even making a moral judgment. Maybe if I'm a World War II vet and I come back in 1945, 46, I just want to go to school and live a peaceful life, whatever. Not judging the working class, just stating this as a fact. The revolutionary working class has not existed in this country for almost a century.
I think what is interesting though is it also has like, maybe you disagree with me, but I also tend to think the existence of a workers movement in Europe is vastly overstated. Um and
Well, Europe just has more powerful things like official union. It's certainly not
right.
revolutionary. It's the classic Christian Democrat socialist concordat of the mid-century, with the socialists becoming slowly weaker but not totally destroyed. They were just totally destroyed in the United States by the Cold War and the Red Scare and the advent of the security state. I mean, it was just wiped out in a real way, and a lot of people leaving it. People turning away from the Soviet Union being the embodiment of Marxism probably wasn't the best thing for Marxism in the North Atlantic world. A lot of different things happened to eradicate the left in the North Atlantic world.
So this leads me to a sort of observation I think we talked about before. I mentioned reading Peter Zion. I've also talked about the fact when I deal with anti-war people, and this actually got me to the right in my 20s, that the right-wing anti-war people tend to be more realistic than left-wing anti-war people. So Andrew Bacevich, who I don't even know it still identifies as a conservative, but he used to. Um, I tend to, when I read his stuff, I tend to think, oh, well, he knows what he's talking about more than when I read a lot of left-wing, quote, anti-imperialist stuff, where I'm like, yeah, but you don't seem to understand how these institutions work at all in your own country, and definitely not what you're projecting on these other places. Why is that, do you think? Is it just a proximity to having some proximity to power, or what do you think's going on there?
I mean, Bessevich is a scholar,
Right.
like a lot of these. I think the people you're referring to aren't,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's just like a different endeavor, fundamentally. I'm thinking of a few people online that it's like it's just clear they haven't thought deeply or long about these things. Bacevich has, um, because there's plenty of people on the right who write plenty of nonsense.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you
They
know,
don't tend to be war skeptics either, though.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, that's very true. Very true. Yeah, very true. I mean, there's something juvenile about left-wing anti-imperialism, at least as manifested online. I don't know the reasons for that. I'm sure there's also a juvenile right-wing anti-imperialism that I'm not aware of. But like, I mean, Bessevich is like one of the best. It's not fair to compare people to him, almost.
that's true.
Yeah,
But even when you read, like, say, realists like John Mersheimer, like, who I
another
often,
scholar.
yeah, another scholar. I
Yeah.
mean,
I mean, these people are just engaged, and this is, I think, where the flattening of something like social media like gets in the way. Like Mersheimer and Bacevich are just fundamentally engaged in something like different.
mm-hmm.
Almost, it's more, I would say, serious than a lot of other things that are going on. I hope that doesn't offend people, but it's just, excuse me, um, Varn, you could cut that out. But I hope that doesn't offend people. But it's just the reality. I mean, I'm sorry. When someone dedicates them decades of their lives to studying something, it's going to be of different quality than someone who's read a lot of posts.
I completely agree. Although I do think in Basevich's case, he's like his actual experience in the military probably helped in a way that some.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Because this is another thing that I can point to now is, well, yes, there are occasionally veterans against the war and left vets or whatever, but in general, the left's experience of civic institutions is almost all low to mid level academic. Like,
Yeah. And now they're adjuncts, so they don't even have the capacity of tenure anymore. So
right.
you're going to see a huge decline in left wing thinking, professional left wing thinking, due to adjuncts. They even got rid of the universities.
So this is something that I actually wanted to ask you about. Is that part of the issue? Is like, well, we had the refuge in the university to do our criticism from, and now we don't have that really. Um, for most of them, I mean, I think about like the origins of Zero Books is, for example, a bunch of scholars who could not get jobs. Some of them got jobs in academia later, but when they formed this, they were just a bunch of PhDs in Europe and the United States who couldn't even get published and could not get work. So they built their own publication sort of train out of blogs that became books, built on a formerly pay to pay publishing apparatus, um, and turn that around. But in general, you know, at first I thought, okay, well, all these academics going out into the general public will be a good thing. You have a lot of people who are trained and have some critical thinking skills who are now out. I don't know that I think that anymore, because I think you're right that the lack of tenure and the lack of the ability to flex is actually affecting their thinking in such a way that any benefit may be mitigated against by that.
Yeah, I mean, any benefit would be probably purely on an intellectual level. I don't think it really has any sort of much material benefit on the ground.
Mm.
You know, I mean, that's just my personal opinion. I think history has shown.
And I think the other thing they tend to intervene in is cultural stuff. And I know you're on record as thinking that's probably the least effective way of doing any kind of political intervention.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, political intervention. No comment on the intellectual worth of it. Zero
Right.
comment on the intellectual worth of it. But are we talking about my propaganda take?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
What?
yeah. That's. I mean, that's also like again. I mean, I wrote a book about propaganda. I just think that information warfare is of fundamentally less importance than other types of social control, like
Mm-hmm.
who gets what, how, and when.
Economic warfare and or bombs are way more important.
Yeah, well, economic warfare like kind of means a specific thing, but who controls
Oh,
the means
excuse
of
me.
production
But
and
yes.
bombs are more important. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Far, far more important. Let's say bombs and who controls the means of production is 80%, and then information warfare is 20%. And I think on the left we talk a lot about the 20%. Or at least not even a lot. No, that's not fair. There's a lot of people who talk a lot about the other things. I will say there is a belief on the left, particularly amongst American leftists, that information is really important. Like you see it in the JFK stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we reveal JFK, this is going to mean something. I mean, I think if everyone, most Americans might now even think that JFK was killed by the CIA. It doesn't matter fundamentally, and ironically, by arguing that oh my God, all the documents are released now we know that Dulles went over and literally pulled the trigger himself, and then Men in Blacked everyone around. What does that matter? That's not it doesn't really mean anything. And in fact, to believe in means something is effectively to endorse on some level something like Habermas's theory of communicative action, where you think that politics really takes place in the sphere of the discursive. And I don't think that's accurate. And I actually think that's kind of not a left thing to think. But in the United States, so many people come to the left through this type of conspiracy world of anti-imperialism
Mm-hmm.
that is part of their identity. And so they get mad when someone says propaganda isn't that important, or at least the people got mad at me.
The one time I've been ratioed was for mocking someone for a JFK conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
it becomes part of someone's identity, like literal identity. That's like mocking their some deep core thing.
it's like their
To me,
religion
it's
or their
just
race or gender or something. It's like, wow.
it's a theory of politics, right? I mean, when you're
Mm-hmm.
when you're saying that the JFK thing matters, you're basically asserting a particular theory of politics. I think it's a theory of politics that is not correct. And that I think it's a theory of politics ultimately linked to more of a liberal tradition than a left wing or Marxist tradition. So in some sense, I get it because it is attacking a theory of politics.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like the debate should be held on that terrain, and you should say, no, here's why I think it's really important that everyone knows this. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we all know that's not what the online sphere is. It's not going to be something different.
That's fair. I mean, my cynical take is political identities tend to be fandoms anyway.
Well,
What
precisely because there's no organic movements and we're not connected to power. So what the hell else are
right?
they going to be? Yeah.
Exactly. Like what else can it possibly be?
They
It's not
can't, they structurally can't be something else. That's what people don't like to hear.
right.
Structurally, they can't be something else. You're not Lenin, to the Finland station. That's not structurally possible
Yeah.
anymore.
If Lenin lived now, he would not be Lenin. Like,
No, he'd be a poster.
yeah. I mean, yeah. I think about that with Marx. I'm like, Marx would have made a hell of a shit poster, but it wouldn't have mattered. Like, would have made a really great shit poster.
Yeah, he was at an early enough stage of development in capitalism and industrialism to diagnose brilliantly a lot of its processes.
Right. And on that note, I guess the conclusion is multipolarity is not really a threat to imperial realism. And we should be much more realistic about how we deal with states and the possibility of what we do. I mean, I'm not quite sure I've gone as far as you on this. On most of the left can't do much, but I am with you on we don't really have any organic relation to power. Most of the relations of power that we do have are in our heads. They're not real. It leads to frustration because we are politicized for very real reasons, and very few of us have opportunities to do anything about it. I mean, people ask me all the time, like, what can I do politically that'll matter? And I'm like, if you can join a union, but I'm also going to admit most of you can't even really join a union. And also, if you join a union, probably it's important and it's good and it'll help, but it's a lot less sexy than you've been told. I say as a union rep,
boring, like, bureaucratic work and showing up.
Yeah, it's a lot of meetings and a lot of,
and particularly in a world where it's hard to feel organic relations to fellow workers because capital again has so destroyed those. So it makes it even more difficult than being in like a union in 1925 in Berlin. Yeah, it's just a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, those unions are having like football club meetings and stuff. We don't do any of that now. I mean, I also talk about that with political parties too. I'm like, political parties before, not in the United States, but in Europe, meant something completely different before World War II.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I enjoyed having you. Anything you'd like to plug or say?
If you're interested, check out my podcast, American Prestige.
Yeah, I would also endorse that. I listen to it regularly. You
man.
guys, your subscription service is now through Substack.
We're through
Patreon.
Substack. Yes, we're through Substack. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.